Morning, everybody. Welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. My name is Eric Chaconis. I am one of our faculty for the Extremity Management course, along with Lindsay Huey and Mark Gallant. If you have been wanting to take Extremity Management, we have a variety of options for you this summer. Mark will be in Oklahoma City, June 24th and 25th. Then he will also be in northern Baltimore, just north of Towson, kind of northern Maryland area, in Glencoe at Sparks Physical Therapy, July 16th and 17th. And then Lindsay will be in Tempe, Arizona, August 5th and 6th, and at our friends Delta Physical Therapy in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, August 20th and 21st. So a number of options for our open courses this summer at a variety of locations if you're interested in taking extremity management. So today's topic is strengthen to lengthen, and this comes from a recent systematic review published in Musculoskeletal Science and Practice. It's an interesting topic centering around the idea of how do we increase mobility, flexibility, fundamentally, how do we simply increase range of motion for someone? And there are a variety of different options, right? You think of static stretching and dynamic stretching, joint mobilization, dry needling, foam rolling, and the list goes on, right, of the different things you could do to try and increase range of motion. And certainly you would expect varying efficacy for all of those interventions. And you see that in the literature. You see varying efficacy for all those different methods to stretch someone or to try and increase somebody's range of motion. And a lot of it depends on your clinical reasoning, right? So the patient's presentation, the condition we're talking about, the level of irritability, patient expectations. There's so many factors that go into which one of these interventions should we select, or which multiple of these interventions should we select to try and help somebody improve range of motion. But one intervention that we typically think of in the context of strength training really needs to be added to that list, and that is eccentric loading. So eccentric loading is actually a very, very helpful intervention to increase range of motion. So a little exercise we'll sometimes do in extremity management is during the course, everybody's partnered up and you measure hamstring flexibility, or a straight leg raise basically, on your partner, right? You get that measurement, and then you have them do a set. Usually it's a pretty arbitrary set of 10, 12, 15 reps of eccentric Nordic ham curls. So the eccentric Nordic ham curl, your partner, the individual, the patient, is kneeling, facing away from you, and you're holding their lower legs down, right? And so they're slowly lowering themselves towards the plinth, keeping their trunk straight. They're slowly lowering themselves, loading their hamstrings in an eccentric fashion. So you do that for a full set, and then you immediately retest. And what you notice is across the board, this happens all the time for almost everybody, an immediate improvement in hamstring flexibility. So range of motion will increase 20 degrees, 30 degrees. I mean, really pretty significant increase in range of motion. And so you ask yourself, why? Why did that happen? What was causing the tightness to begin with? Why did I measure their hamstring length at 70 degrees and now it's at 90? What's the mechanism there? And so there's a variety of things. When it happens in an acute, that's an acute response, right? You have to think, well, is fatigue a component of it? Perhaps resting tone was what was stopping them from having full range of motion of the hamstrings. Is it a neurological phenomenon, right? There's a neurological response where there's more relaxation and then they're not guarding as much, perhaps, right? So there's a lot of different elements to this. But when we look at the literature across the board, one thing we know is it also carries over long term. So when somebody goes through an eccentric program, a loaded eccentric exercise, we'll take heel drops, for example. We see an increase over a period of weeks in ankle dorsiflexion range of motion improvement. So it's a great intervention to improve range of motion, not only in the short term, but also the long term. What hasn't been done, and this was kind of the primary aim of this systematic review, is nobody's really quantified the magnitude of that effect when you compare it to other interventions. So if we compare that eccentric loading program to improve range of motion to a concentric program, or to a control group, or to just a stretching program, right? There's a lot of different comparative effectiveness studies out there that have looked at that. And so this is a systematic review, essentially compiling all of those studies into one. And there's a meta-analysis component to it. So they end up with 32 trials, includes over 1,100 individuals. 27 of the trials got pooled into the meta-analysis. You have a pretty big 1,000 subject-ish meta-analysis, pretty robust sample that's covering a variety of different muscle groups. So that's one thing they did for this is they had not only looking at hamstring mobility, quadriceps muscular range of motion, so knee flexion when the hip is extended, and ankle dorsiflexion, and then they had a few shoulder studies in there as well. It's a high-quality systematic review. They included risk of bias, which is a really important component to any systematic review. You get that measure of the quality of the evidence. So, and as they analyzed, one of the outcomes they looked at was fascial and muscular length, right? That specific muscular length. And the quality of evidence for that outcome wasn't really at the level you would want it to be to interpret the results. So moderate to low quality of evidence, hard to trust those results. But when you simply looked at range of motion improvements after an eccentric loading program, the risk of bias actually checked out in a very positive light. And there was not, it was a high quality, right? High quality evidence for that outcome. So when you're looking at range of motion, the effect size was large and the quality of evidence was high. So this is a really strong finding for us as far as a systematic review goes. You get an effect size of 0.54. What that tells you is I can be fairly confident if somebody goes to an eccentric loading program of the quadriceps, hamstrings, ankle plantar flexors, or shoulder rotators, we're going to see an improvement in range of motion compared to other control group, no intervention, or concentric intervention. And so you're going to expect a moderate change in range of motion. Most of those cases, I think based on that, you should add eccentric training to your program when you want to increase range of motion. Now, you're probably wondering, what are the specific exercises that they're using? There's a lot of different ways that I can eccentrically load a muscle group. What did they do in those studies? For the ankle, for the plantar flexors, it was almost always that heel drop. So we're loading them up, and this is the one mistake some of these studies make. They're not loading them up with a weight that is commensurate with eccentric loading. The only reason I eccentric load something is because I cannot concentrically control that weight. So you think of overload training, if you were working on, we'll use bench press, for example. If you were working on your bench press max, right, overload training, the only reason you're doing eccentrics or negatives is because you're exceeding your 1 rep max and doing a weight that you cannot concentrically move. So I would try and do that same thing when you're looking at range of motion. For the heel drop, you got to load them up and you got to add a sufficient amount of weight that they're not going to be able to concentrically just do a regular old heel raise with. This is a heavy weight. All they can do is lower it, right? For the one leg, they can go up concentrically with both legs and then down with one leg is the easiest way to get that done. So we saw that across the board. All those old studies on Achilles tendinopathy, and we learned the benefit of loading to the Achilles eccentrically probably isn't there. It's probably, when we look at tendinopathies, it's probably just simply load that helps them. It doesn't necessarily need to be an eccentric control. But for range of motion, that's not the case. For range of motion, the eccentric contraction is actually really important. For the hamstrings, it was actually the Nordic ham curl most of the time. So that Nordic ham curl I described earlier, that's the intervention that they did in most of these studies to improve hamstring flexibility. Some used manual resistance. That's another really nice option where you, the clinician, are resisting them as they're trying to eccentrically control that hamstring, right, into hip flexion. And I've always loved that because I can feel it, I can control it, I can modify it, I can tweak the angle a little bit. When I notice they're getting tired, I can dial it back. When I notice they're weak or there's a sticking point, I can hammer that sticking point and spend a little more time in a certain range of motion. So manual resistance eccentric loading is great, especially for the hamstrings and quadriceps, and especially if you don't have an isokinetic dynamometer, which most of us do not in the clinic. So you become the isokinetic dynamometer. You adjust their range of motion or provide them with that load throughout the range of motion. Really nice hands-on way to get that eccentric loading. And then, and that was the case for quadriceps. Most of the time it was isokinetic dynamometer. That's one of the most common ways that they've done that in some of the research. But again, a few of those studies used manual resistance for the quadriceps, and you could certainly do that in the clinic. So hopefully that helps. Check out this study. It'll be in Hump Day Hustling tomorrow. So our Wednesday edition of Hump Day Hustling. If you're not signed up already for Hump Day Hustling, every Wednesday we send you to your inbox a summary of the latest research that we find beneficial and helpful. So it's a really nice, get on our email list. If you go to our website, ptonice.com, scroll down to the bottom, you can sign up for Hump Day Hustling and get that every Wednesday. So we hope you take advantage of that, and take care, everybody.